Welcome back. So up until now, everything we've been doing around events and event listeners and the DOM and DOM manipulation and DOM selectors, we've just been doing one-off quick exercises that don't really amount to much. And that was just to kind of show individual pieces how they work. Now we're going to see how they all fit together and make a somewhat substantial app. So as you can see, this is not the most beautiful app. That's coming. We're just focusing on how conceptually the pieces fit together here, how we take events, how we select elements, how we write HTML, and how those all fit together. Styling is just extra at this point. But in the next project we make, we are going to place a lot of focus on styling and making it look nice, I promise. So what we're going to make is a simple scorekeeping app. So I want you to think back to all those times that you've been playing rock, paper, scissors with a friend, or ping pong, or tic-tac-toe, and it's just so tiring to keep track of the score. It's so difficult to know who's winning when. So this app is for you. The way that it works, 2 players, player 1 score, player 2 score. You load up the page and it tells us we're playing to 5. And so all we do is add a point by clicking on a button. So to add a point to player 1, we click on player 1. If we want to add a point to player 2, we click on player 2. And then whoever gets to 5, you notice it turns green. And if I try and score again, I can't. That's because the game is over. So I can reset by clicking the reset button. And now let's have player 2 totally sweep. And that's it. We can't play anymore. And we click reset. So one more feature is that we can also specify what we're playing to. So if we want to have a game that goes until 7, I can use this number input here. And then all I have to do is, let's make this a closer game. And player 1 just sneaks by at the end, 7-5, and the game ends at 7. And player 1 turns green, and we can't add any more points, and then we can reset again. So that's what we're going to focus on building here. So the first thing we want to do is get our file set up, and then create the HTML structure, and then we'll go in with JavaScript and make things work. So let's go ahead and get started. So I have a blank HTML document. I'm calling it scorekeeper.html. Going to add in our boilerplate and give it a title, just like that. And then let's start by talking about what we're looking at here. So this is an H1, and we will be changing this eventually. We don't want it just to be a solid H1 because there's 2 things inside of this H1. It needs to be like player 1 score to player 2 score, but we need to be able to select this separately from this. So we do want a way to divide this H1 into smaller pieces. So we'll see how we can do that in just a little bit. So next, this is a paragraph here, playing to, and let's just write playing to 7 to start, or let's do 5, I think that's what I had it at. And then we have an input here. This is input type equals number. So input type equals number, and that's all we need. And then we have our first button, player 1, our second button, player 2, and our last button, reset. So if we refresh this page, and now we open up our own page that we created, let's take a look. They look pretty much the same. Zoom in a little bit on this one. That looks just right. Of course, nothing happens when we click on anything. So now let's go and add our JavaScript in. So I'm going to create a new file. I'm going to call it scorekeeper.js. And like I always do, I'm going to add my alert here that says connected. Then I'm going to go over to scorekeeper.html and include my script. And I'm going to do it at the bottom here to start. So script, type equals JavaScript, source equals scorekeeper.js. Just like that. And now if we refresh, this is my version of the page. It tells me JavaScript alert, connected. All right, so we have our HTML set up. It looks great. What we need to do now is get some JavaScript code that actually adds some functionality. And as always, we need to start by selecting the different elements. So let's start by selecting the buttons. And let's just do the player 1 and player 2 buttons. And the first feature we'll focus on is when we click one of these buttons, the score should increment up here. So all we need to do is start by selecting that player 1 button. And if we look, it's just a button. We may want to add an ID. So we'll call this P1. And down here, we'll add one for P2. And then we can also add one for the reset that we'll just call reset. So we have 3 IDs now. So it's much easier to select. We'll just call it var p1 button equals document dot query selector, or we could do get element by ID. I will mix them up here. So the first one we'll do with query selector p1, and then p2 button will be document dot, and we'll do get element by ID, and we don't need that octothorpe anymore. So that gives us the 2 buttons. And let's just set up our first listener. When we click on this first button, we'll alert or console.log something. So we want to write p1 button dot add event listener on click, and then we add our function here. And inside that function, we're just going to alert clicked, and that's it. So if we refresh our page and we try clicking, great. That tells us we selected correctly and we added our listener for the click event correctly. Player 2, though, doesn't do anything because we only added that to the player 1 button. So now let's talk about how this will actually work. When I click here, we need to have some variable that's called player 1 score or something that keeps track of how many points player 1 has. And I click, it should add 1 to player 1 score. And then the last part is updating this here to reflect player 1 score. So I'm going to make a variable. Let's just call it p1 score and set it to be 0 to start. And then all I want to do is when we click, we'll start by just always adding 1 to the player 1 score. So that will just be p1 score plus plus, just like that. And we refresh, and we won't see anything because we should probably console.log p1 score first rather than alert. Alert gets very annoying very fast. If we refresh now and open up the console and we click player 1 score, you can see it goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and it's going to keep going. So there's a few problems. One is we're not displaying the score here. And 2, it says we're playing to 5, and that's obviously not the case because we're just incrementing it as much as we want. So we'll need to have some logic that says if greater than 5, game over or something like that. But let's start by figuring out how we can update this h1. So what we could do is just select the h1 to start. So let's just call it var h1 equals document dot query selector h1, just like that. And then inside of here, we'll just say h1 dot text content equals p1 score, just like that. So we're going to take this h1 and change the text content to be whatever the score is that we're console.logging. And if I score here, well, that sort of works, but you can see that we completely overrode everything that was inside of h1. We want to keep the 2 and the other score. We just want to change this one number. So there's a way of doing that using some extra HTML that makes our life a lot easier. If we go back to our scorekeeper.html, we're going to introduce a span element. And the way that the span will work is that it will only wrap around the number, the score. So what that means is we can now, if I inspect this, nothing looks like it changes, and that's the point of a span. It's just a non-intrusive, if you will. It's just a way to wrap something with some tag that you can then use later or style differently or select with JavaScript, which is exactly what we'll do. If we look, we have our h1, but right here we now have a special span wrapping that number. So if we select that span and change that span only, we'll still have the TO and our spacing correctly and the other score. So we want to select that span. And I'm going to, again, just do an ID here. So span, and we'll just call this P1 display, just like that. And now we need to go to our scorekeeper.js and change a few things. So we don't need to select the H1 anymore. I'm going to get rid of that. We're going to select var P1 display equals document.get. And let's do query selector just for variety again. Query selector, and we called it P1 display. So that will just give us the span. And if we wanted to check that that was working, why don't we just do a console.log right here, P1 display, just to see when we load the page, refresh, it should print out Okay, it selected our span correctly. Okay, so now what we want to do, get rid of that, is add one to the score. We can get rid of our other console.log. And rather than changing the text content on the whole H1, we just want to change it on our P1 display, which is this little span right here. And if we refresh now, there we go. So we get that player 1 display updating. Player 2 still doesn't do anything, but we have this feature working. So let's do the same thing for player 2. So I'll go back, add in another span around our 0. So span ID equals P2 display, and then move the 0 in between. We refresh, nothing should look different, but we now have 2 spans, as you can see. Then let's go back to our scorekeeper.js, and let's add in 2 new variables. So we need the display span for player 2. We need to select it with that ID. I'll use query selector again. And then we need a variable for the score of player 2, because we don't want them just to be the same score. Obviously, we need 2 separate ways of tracking their values. So the first thing that I want to do is test that our player 2 button is selected correctly. So I'm just going to do a console.log player 2 button and just see what it prints out. And if we refresh and we look in the console, you can see something's awry. We selected the player 1 button, not the player 2 button. So something is wrong with our selector, which you can see here. We're selecting element by ID P1, which is the same as what we had up here. So we need to select P2 instead. Okay, so now that that's taken care of, if we refresh, we get button with ID P2, which is great. So now let's add in our listener. So P2 button.add event listener. Click. And I always like to start by just printing something out or alerting something. Console.log P2 clicked. Just like that. Refresh. And we get P2 clicked. Our player 1 still works, and P2 is running some code. Now we just need to put the right code in there. If we take a look at what we did for the player 1 button, we need a player 2 score variable to increment to start. So var P2 score, and that should start as 0 as well. And then we'll just come here and just change this to be P2 score ++. And then we need to update it in the display, which we haven't yet selected. So we also need to select that span. Remember this span right here, ID of P2 display. So we're going to do that. I'm just going to copy that line and change it P2 display, document.querySelector, P2 display. And then we'll just change the display on P2, the text content, to be equal to the player 2 score. So let's take a look. I click on player 1, that still works. How about player 2? That works as well. Okay, so there is no end to our game right now. This would just keep going forever. So we need to work on adding that functionality. And the way that we're going to do that is with a variable that's going to keep track of the state of our game. So our game has 2 states. The first one is the normal state right now, where I can click, where I can play the game. And the second state would be what we might call game over, where someone has won. So we need 2 states, and we can use a Boolean to model that, just a true or false, and I'm going to call it game over. So var game over, and it starts as false because game over is not true at the beginning of the game. And then what we'll do is we'll update game over to be true or false depending on if someone wins. So if someone gets to 5, game over should now be true. And that should mean that we can no longer update the score and that we have to hit reset. And reset should then make game over false again and start everything over. So let me show you what I mean. The first thing we'll want to do is add another variable. I'm going to call it winning score. And that's just going to be equal to 5. So that variable is what we're going to compare player 1 and player 2 score to. So we're going to check, has the player 1 score reached the winning score? If he or she has, then we need to say game over is true. So the logic will look like this. We're going to have an if statement, and it's just going to look like if game over is not been reached yet. So if not game over, then we're going to let you add to the score, just like this. When I run this right now, you won't notice anything different. It will work exactly the same way for player 1, and that's because game over is always false. It never changes. So when would we change it to be true? Well, when there's a game over. And when that happens is when the user's score, so when player 1's score, is equal to the winning score. So after we add 1 to player 1's score, we'll just check. If, let's do P1 score, triple equals winning score. So if they're equal to one another, then let's start by just saying console.log game over, just like that. And if we refresh and we view our console, and I try changing this, so far this is not true, so this never happens. This time though, I add 1, player 1 score goes to 5, we're checking if player 1 score is equal to winning score, and we get game over down here. So rather than just console.logging game over, we actually want to change the state where now game over is true. So what that will do for us, I'll show you if I refresh, is it will prevent us from adding more to the score. Because game over is true, this little check up here, it checks, is it game over yet? And if it is game over, none of this code runs. So let's try that. I get to 5 and I'm stuck. I can't increase it anymore. However, I can go to player 2 and increase that score because our logic is only for player 1. We'll want to go over to this player 2 button at event listener and add in the same logic. So if it's not game over, then we'll let you increment the score and update the display. And then we also need to check if the new player 2 score is equal to the winning score, then it is game over. Game over is true, which means that the neither user, player 1 or player 2, can continue to increment the score anymore. So let's check that this works. Refresh. Okay, we can get to 5 here and we're done. Player 2 doesn't work, or we can get to 5 over here and we're done, and player 1 doesn't work either.